Honda's ProLink rear suspension is a performance trendsetter, the first truly progressive suspension system for motorcycles. ProLink is that once elusive, ideal suspension system, softly damped and sprung at the beginning of rear-wheel travel and becoming progressively tougher as suspension loads increase, to resist bottoming on even the bigger jumps. And it all happens because of ProLink's unique linkage design, which precisely matches spring rate with damping rate throughout the full range of suspension travel and load. But as good, as sophisticated as ProLink is, it must be carefully serviced and adjusted to work its best. And service is easy when you know what you're doing. Like Greg Arnett. Greg probably knows ProLink about as well as the fellows who designed it. You see, Greg heads up Honda's Pro Support team. And you can believe he has a lot of time invested in ProLink, what with keeping a whole squad of pro motocross bikes in winning shape week after week.
Yeah, that's right. I do a lot of suspension work. And that includes a lot of testing for Honda. But like you said, servicing ProLink is easy when you know what you're doing.
And that's what this program is all about, learning how to correctly service and adjust the ProLink shock absorber. During this program, Greg will be sharing his experience with us and any special tips he may have. Before we get started, let's take a look at what we'll accomplish. Let's look at the objectives. After you view this program and practice the simple techniques that are described with a shop manual for reference, you'll be able to identify a ProLink shock absorber that requires service. Disassemble, inspect, assemble, and adjust an oil nitrogen unit. Disassemble, inspect, assemble, and adjust an oil air unit. And inspect and adjust the preload on the non-serviceable unit. Let's begin by taking a quick look at each of the three types of ProLink shock absorbers. The first unit is the oil and nitrogen shock that's used on XRR and CRR models. It's fully serviceable and adjustable, both for spring preload and damping rate. Next, there's the oil and air shock that's installed on the GL500 and GL500 Interstate, the CX500 Turbo, the CBX, and the V45 Sabre. This shock is also fully serviceable and can be adjusted for varied loads. Finally, there's the non-serviceable unit that's fitted to the XL250 and 500R models. All right, let's get started with the oil and nitrogen unit. First, find out if a shock absorber needs service. If the customer has a complaint about rear suspension performance, listen carefully to what he says.
And then, when I've got it straight up and down and gas it, it just doesn't hook up.
Always ask questions. Get all the information you can.
Ask him to describe exactly what happens and under what conditions. And be sure to check the preload. It's likely that it will be too much.
Check the damping adjustment. It may be dialed in wrong. Even if you can test ride the bike, not all suspension trouble will show up right away. It's easy to see then why customer information is so important. Low nitrogen pressure is a common cause of poor shock performance. A pressure check with the ProGas unit will soon tell you if this could be the trouble. If it's below spec, recharge it, and you might fix the problem right here. Before you check the shock, put the bike on a stand to get the rear wheel off the ground so your pressure readings will be accurate.
Don't pass on this check just because the shock's new. Even a new one could be low. The shock will lose about 25 psi when the ProGas is hooked up. So if the gauge reads 245 to 270, the pressure's okay. Just remember to charge it back up to 270 to 298 before you disconnect the unit.
And we'll talk about this later. Check the reservoir, the shock, and the hose for damage. Make sure the fittings are tight. And look carefully for signs of oil leakage. The hose, fittings, and reservoir should be dry. Very light oil film on the damper is of course normal.
If there's a lot of oil on the dampener rod, the seal is probably worn and the shock will have to be replaced.
The shock absorber has to be removed for any service beyond charging or adjustment. Make sure the motorcycle is safely blocked up with the rear wheel off the ground, and remove the parts required to get to the shock. Remove the reservoir and shock assembly from the bike, and then remove the spring. Inspect the bushings in the shock link and arm. If they're grooved or mushroomed on the ends, replace them. Measure the spring and compare its free length to the service standard. If it's shorter than the service limit, replace it.
You can fine-tune your customer's CR with optional springs. There are both stiffer and softer than stock springs for the full-size models, and there's an optional softer one for the Cr250. Check an owner's manual or the job aid with this program for the correct part numbers.
If you don't have a ProGas unit, you can use a bathroom scale to see if the shock's within spec. If the pressure's okay, 62 to 84 pounds of force are required to compress the shock 10 millimeters. That's about 4/10 of an inch. If adjustment and charging won't do it, you have to drain and refill the shock and reservoir. Begin by relieving the gas pressure in the reservoir. Be careful to point the reservoir away from you when you press in the Schrader valve. When the pressure is fully relieved, remove the valve core, then disconnect the hose and drain the reservoir.
Pump the shock several times to get out all the oil, and before you throw the oil away, check it for bits of metal and seal material. They're a good indication that the whole shock should be replaced.
Now we come to a very important part, filling the shock with oil. And here's how you do it. Extend the shock and carefully pour in oil. Honda recommends Bel-Ray LT56 for normal use, or Golden Spectro Light for heavy riders and for very fast average-size riders, particularly in hot weather. Next, slowly push the shock rod in to force out trapped air.
Be careful and take your time. Just make sure there's no air in the system once it's filled. If you don't get out all the air, the shock won't work correctly.
Now, slowly pull the rod out and continue to fill the shock until the oil reaches the top of the threads in the hole. Remove the Schrader valve core from the reservoir and fill the reservoir with oil through the hose connection port. Next, shape the reservoir diaphragm to get rid of unwanted air. Connect the ProGas unit and pressurize the reservoir to 28 psi. Hold your thumb firmly over the hole in the reservoir to keep the oil in. Then, release the pressure. Lightly coat 2 new O-rings with grease and install one on each end of the hose. Connect the hose to the shock and tighten the fitting. Submerge the free end of the hose in a container of fresh shock oil. Slowly stroke the shock in and out, several times if necessary, until there are no more bubbles in the oil. This ensures that the shock and the hose are completely filled with oil. Then connect the hose to the reservoir and tighten the fitting. For 1983 models, the shock can be disassembled for service. After the shock is depressurized, separated from the hose and reservoir, and the oil is drained, remove the cap. After you remove the circlip from the shock body, and before you pull out the damper rod assembly, carefully remove any burrs from the top edge of the circlip groove. Otherwise, the O-ring and damper piston ring may be damaged when the damper is removed or installed. Then remove the damper assembly and thoroughly clean it and the shock body. Replace the damper rod piston ring and the O-ring. Fill the shock body with oil, install the damper rod assembly, the circlip, and the cap. Then connect the hose to the shock and submerge the free end in a container of fresh shock oil. Keep the hose fitting on the shock up and slowly stroke the shock in and out until there are no more air bubbles in the oil. Use a new sealing washer on each side of the banjo fitting and connect it to the reservoir. Take care not to lose any oil or draw any air into the system. Now you're ready for the next step, charging the shock with nitrogen. Earlier we pointed out that the shock can be charged while it's on the bike, but if the unit is already off the bike, it can and should be charged on the bench.
That's right. If it doesn't hold pressure, it'll have to be replaced, so you shouldn't install it until you know it's okay.
Check the ProGas unit to make sure all the valves are closed and sufficient nitrogen supply pressure is available. The sequence is covered in detail in service letter number 133. Connect the T-valve fitting of the handpiece to the charging valve on the reservoir. Tighten the fitting hand tight. Don't use a wrench or you'll damage the valve in the reservoir. Open the T-valve. Then open the input valve until the gauge indicates 270 to 298 psi. Then close the T-valve and disconnect it from the reservoir. Finally, shut down and bleed the ProGas unit. If you're checking system pressure, do it the same way. When the ProGas is connected, there will be a loss of about 25 psi system pressure. Well, now you're ready to assemble the shock and install it.
Line up the punch mark in the link with the edge of the shock clevis before you tighten the bolt. If it's tightened at any other position, the rod will bind in the shock when it's installed. And be sure to lube the shock arm and link bushings with a good grade of disulfide grease. And one other important point. Route the reservoir hose outside the frame and hook it under the clip to keep it away from the exhaust pipe and out of the spring.
Now you're ready to adjust the spring preload for your customer. First, measure the distance from the seat bolt, or exhaust system bolt, to the center of the rear axle. Do this with the wheel off the ground and the suspension fully extended. Here it's 600 millimeters, or about 23 5/8 inches.
The extended distance won't be the same for all bikes. It's okay if it varies a couple of millimeters either way.
Next, take the motorcycle off the stand so both wheels are on the ground. Have your customer sit on the bike and make sure he's sitting well forward on the seat with his weight at the center of the bike. Again, measure the distance between the bolt and the center of the axle. In this position, the distance is 493 millimeters, or about 19 7/16 inches. Compare the two measurements. The difference should be 95 to 105 millimeters. That's about 3 3/4 to 4 1/8 inches. In this example, the difference is 107 millimeters, or 4 3/16 inches, not quite enough preload. So to correct the preload, just loosen the lock nut on the shock and turn the adjuster down to increase it. One complete turn of the adjuster changes the spring length 1.5 millimeters, or about 1/16 of an inch. The change at the axle is greater, so it's a good idea to remeasure after 1 or 2 turns. Then, when the distance is correct, tighten the lock nut. Damping adjustment can't be anticipated. It must be done for specific track conditions. However, it's a good idea to set the damper at the standard position at the number 2 detent for 1982 models, and at the 10 position on rebound and 6 on compression for 1983 models.
Make sure the rider understands how the dampening adjuster should be used. Show him the table in his owner's manual. It's simple and it works.
Okay, let's recap and review the complete diagnosis and service procedures for the oil nitrogen shock. You'll begin by asking your customer to describe symptoms, not just guess at the cause. And check gas pressure before removing the shock. It should be 270 to 298 psi. Don't forget that 25 psi you lose during hookup. And remember to charge the shock back up to spec before you disconnect the progas. Keep that high pressure in mind when you're working on the shock.
Always point the reservoir valve away from yourself when you're discharging the system, and away from anyone else as well.
Make sure the shock, the reservoir, and the hose are completely filled with shock oil, and that there is no air in the system. When charging the shock, make sure you have sufficient supply pressure. Tighten the unit's T-valve to the reservoir by hand only. Don't use a wrench. Pressurize the shock to 270 to 298 psi. Adjust spring preload for the rider. The correct difference is 100 millimeters plus or minus 5.
Make sure the customer understands how to adjust dampening and how to dial it in with the help of his owner's manual.
Well, that about does it for servicing and adjusting the Oil Nitrogen ProLink. Let's move on to the Oil Air ProLink shock that's used on some road bikes. As with the Oil Nitrogen unit, first find out if the unit needs service. Listen carefully to what the customer says. Check the bike's mileage. If the motorcycle has a lot of miles, the trouble could be something as simple as normal seal wear. Also check the air pressure. The specified pressure ranges are shown on the motorcycle's decal. If the pressure is out of spec for the motorcycle's load, correct it. Inspect the airline and joints for leaks.
And check for oil on the lower shock leg. A light film is normal, but an excessive amount indicates a worn seal.
Test ride the motorcycle and attempt to duplicate any conditions the owner described. All right, let's assume you're able to confirm the customer's complaint and the shock needs servicing. This is a bench job, so you'll have to remove the shock. First, set the motorcycle on the center stand and place a block under the rear wheel.
This makes it easier to remove the shock mounting bolts and to get them back in later.
Next, remove any parts that prevent you from getting to the mounting bolts and fittings. These vary somewhat from one model to another, so check the shop manual for details. Shock removal for different models is similar, but there are some important differences.
On all models, be sure to support the shock before removing the last bolt so it doesn't fall.
After you've released the pressure and pressed the backup plate down, remove the snap ring as you see here. Now you're ready to remove the old seal, and it's simple. First, fill the lube pump with ATF and connect it to the air fitting on the shock. Install the seal driver on the shock, cover it with a shop towel, and secure the towel with a large hose clamp or a ring compressor. And pump ATF into the shock. In about a minute and a half, presto, you've hydraulic the seal out safely, and just as important, without a mess. Now you're just about ready for a new seal. But first, check the oil level in the shock. It must be even with the ridge that stops the guide bushing.
This is very important because it helps ensure that the shock contains the correct amount of oil.
Install the guide bushing. Wrap tape around the end of the shock to protect the seal. Coat the seal with fresh ATF and install it. Then install the backup plate and the lock ring or circlip. To make sure the shock has just the right amount of oil, first remove the core from the air valve. Then slowly compress the shock to drain the prescribed amount.
The amount is different for each model, so check the shop manual.
Now screw the core into the air valve and you're about ready to install the shock. After you've checked the shock and linkage bushings and replaced any that are worn or damaged, lube them with moly disulfide grease. Then install the shock and linkage and tighten the bolts to spec. Pressurize the shock to the recommended level. Then check for leaks and correct any you find. Finally, verify your work with a test ride. Okay, let's review what you've learned about the Oil Air ProLink shock. First, gather all the information you can, both from the customer and from a test ride.
Before you remove the lock ring, be sure to release the air pressure and drive the seal down.
Make sure the oil level is correct before you install a new seal, and double check the amount to be removed that's specified in the shop manual. It's essential that the shock contain a precise predetermined amount of oil for it to dampen correctly. Finally, make sure the bushings are in good shape, adequately lubed, and the bolts are tightened to specified torques. All right, let's take a look at the third type of ProLink shock, the non-serviceable unit that's used on XLR models. While you can't service this unit when a customer complains about poor suspension performance, you can inspect it for damage and wear.
And you can check it for correct spring preload. Many customers crank in too much and override the dampening at the beginning of the suspension travel. Check the shop manual for the correct amount of preload.
And check the arm and link bushings for wear and damage. Make sure they're lubricated with moly disulfide grease, and check the bolts for tightness. If this doesn't fix the problem, replace the shock. Well, that pretty well covers inspection and service of Honda's three types of ProLink suspension. You've seen what work is required, and you've learned how to determine if a unit requires service or should be replaced.
The key to ProLink service is care. And don't rush things. Make sure the unit is correctly filled and charged. And make sure it's adjusted correctly for the rider and for riding conditions.
Whether it's a CR or CX500 Turbo, this full-cycle program can get you started. When combined with hands-on practice and prescribed shop manuals and service bulletins, along with the job aid, it will provide you with a solid base for successfully servicing Honda's ProLink suspension.